So this is an issue I've been meaning to talk about for a while. It's an issue that I've been aware about for several years, actually. But I really, really want to draw attention to it because I don't think it's getting the traction it deserves. So, decades after forced sterilization, Native American women in the U.S. still face rejection and re-traumatization in healthcare. This is an article from ladyscience.com, 2009. Since the founding of the United States, the battle for reproductive rights has been fraught. Despite Native women's historic practices of timing pregnancies, and regulating their number of children, the Puritan foundations of the country came to outlaw such autonomy. Through lawsuits and legislation, those rights were gradually restored. With the ruling of Roe v. Wade in January of 1973, women across the country celebrated a milestone marking their right to determine reproductive outcomes. At the same time, crushing policies from the U.S. government seized childbearing potential from thousands of Native people. The Indian Health Service, IHS, formed in 1955 within the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, HUE, forcibly sterilized as many as 70,000 Native women during the 1970s, often without their consent or knowledge. This action demonstrated the harsh contrast between the increasing freedom of white women and the continuing genocide of Native communities. Under the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964, HUE and other federal agencies were tasked with administering family planning programming to poor and indigent populations. In accordance with this policy, IHS began providing family planning services for Native Americans in 1965. While a directive stressed that family planning should include information about different types of birth control and their side effects, the reality of the services rapidly escalated from contraception to eugenics. When eugenics dangerously surged in popularity in the early 20th century, many states introduced compulsory sterilization statutes. In Virginia, the Racial Integrity Act of 1924 encouraged the sexual sterilization of the institutionalized to promote the health of the patient and the welfare of society. That same year, Carrie Buck, a feeble-minded woman committed to a mental institution, unknowingly provided the perfect opportunity for the state to test the legality of its new law. In the case of Buck v. Bell, which upheld Virginia's new statute for forced sterilization, Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. wrote that, "It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime, or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind." But even when 26 states followed suit and practiced similar legislation, physicians initially still feared possible malpractice suits for unnecessary procedures. Marion Jessen, a North California woman, sued her county hospital for refusing to perform a medically unnecessary sterilization operation. A California Court of Appeals judge ruled, "Voluntary sterilization is legal when informed consent has been given, that sterilization is an acceptable method of family planning, and that sterilization may be a fundamental right requiring constitutional protection." This decision has been applauded by women's rights activists across the country for opening a door for women to willingly seek out sterilization for contraceptive purposes. At the same time, it set a dangerous foundation for IHS physicians to ramp up their sterilization practices. Following the 1969 ruling of Jessen v. County of Shasta, doctors became confident in their legal ability to perform the procedures provided they had the consent of the patient. IHS was formed to fulfill U.S. treaty obligations to provide health care, though it didn't take on that name until its third year of operation in 1958. The agency, historically underfunded, has never provided an adequate level of care to Native people. In 2014, the IHS per capita expenditures for patient health services were just $3,107, compared to $8,097 per capita nationally. While resources stagnated and Native populations grew, the number of patients per physician in the IHS system rose from 1,220 in 1966 to 1,500 in 1980. Motivated by racist stereotypes and laws that empowered eugenics, the overworked federal employees of IHS saw the high birth rate of Native Americans as a problem that could only be solved with their extreme family planning methods. Historian Jane Lawrence writes that some IHS doctors did not believe American Indian and other minority women had the intelligence to use other methods of birth control effectively, and thought that there were already too many minority individuals causing problems in the nation. The 1970 census reveals that the average Native woman bore 3.29 children, whereas the median for the entire U.S. was 2.48 children. Following the end of the forced sterilization period, the 1980 census showed that the average number of children born per Native woman had plummeted to 1.3. The American Indian Movement, AIM, first discovered evidence of the ongoing involuntary sterilization of Native American women in records they removed after occupying the Bureau of Indian Affairs in 1972. 4 years after the practice was uncovered, the U.S. Government Accountability Office began investigating. In a survey of 4 IHS locations, they found that between 1973 and 1976, 3,406 sterilization procedures were performed on Native women in Aberdeen, Albuquerque, Oklahoma City, and Phoenix. Across the entire country, an estimated 25% of Native women of childbearing age were sterilized by 1976. While sterilization procedures should only have been presented as one of the many contraceptive options, Native women were often coerced into signing forms or given incorrect information about their options. In one case, 2 15-year-old Native girls on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation in Montana were admitted to the local clinic for tonsillectomies and released with tubal ligations. Another woman in Los Angeles was told that her hysterectomy would be reversible, only to find out 6 years later that she had been lied to. Others still were given forms to sign for painkillers or appendectomies, finding out later that they had relinquished their ability to bear children. Unfortunately, the history of forced sterilizations in the U.S. extends far beyond Native women. In 1973, African American sisters Minnie and Mary Ralph, 12 and 14 years old at the time, were secretly sterilized by a federally funded clinic under the premise of giving the girls birth control shots. Mexicans and their U.S.-born descendants were described as immigrants of an undesirable type, and thousands of women were forcibly sterilized in California institutions from 1920 to 1950. The U.S. is responsible for tens of thousands of state-sponsored non-consensual sterilization procedures, all done to control populations of people deemed inferior. For the indigenous victims, their lifelong pain is compounded by the fact that IHS has never issued an apology. Sharon Asatoyer Comanche, the executive director of the Native American Women's Health Education Resource Center, spoke to Rewire News in 2018 about the effect this practice had on women's mental health. Women were ashamed when the power to give life was stripped from them, Asatoyer said. Women are considered sacred in Native cultures. They are the life givers. Many women drank themselves to death when they learned that IHS had sterilized them. For Native families, this is a painful part of a very recent memory. Many women that were victims of these cruel policies have difficulty discussing their stories, and they are often shamed into silence. After finding out about the IHS policy, the British filmmaker Lorna Tucker decided to create a documentary. Because of the stigma, it took years of building trust with community members before they would speak openly about their experiences. The film Amma is currently screening in the UK. To this day, Native people are wary of IHS. Though the forced sterilizations contribute to the suspicion, a poll from NPR, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and Harvard's T.H. Chan School of Public Health found that a quarter of Natives reported experiencing discrimination when going to a doctor or health clinic. Additionally, the IHS remains underfunded. Procedures that aren't vital to life or limb rarely get approval. Given the compounding historical trauma and racism that Natives experience, one would hope they'd be eager to claim the healing provisions their ancestors secured through treaties. Instead, the conditions of the IHS leaves Indigenous people who seek treatment wondering if they'll find only rejection, or worse, re-traumatization. This is written by Mariah Gladstone, Blackfeet Cherokee. She was raised in northwest Montana and graduated from Columbia University with a degree in environmental engineering and returned home to work in Indigenous advocacy. Mariah has been recognized as a champion for change through the Center for Native American Youth, a culture of health leader through the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and a Grist 50 fixer. So there's also this article from National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. It's called The Past and Current United States Policies of Forced Sterilization by Jacqueline Oktuka. Support immediate investigation of forced sterilization of Indigenous women by the Department of Homeland Security. On October 2, 2020, the United States House of Representatives passed a resolution condemning unwanted, unnecessary medical procedures on individuals without their full informed consent. It states, whereas a growing number of women are coming forward to share stories of unwanted, unnecessary medical procedures, including full or partial hysterectomies and other procedures involving their reproductive organs, performed without their knowledge or consent. The resolution is in part a reaction to a complaint filed to the Department of Homeland Security on September 16, 2020, expressing concerns about unnecessary hysterectomies performed on detained immigrant women without their informed consent. Dawn Wooten's whistleblower account is terrifying and brings to light the generational trauma caused by efforts to exterminate communities of color and people with disabilities. We need an investigation, said Representative Deb Haaland, Democrat NM, or DNM, I'm not sure what that means, a tribal citizen of the Laguna Pueblo. Haaland and 172 other congressional members signed a letter calling on the Inspector General of Homeland Security to open an investigation. It states, the reports of mass hysterectomies cause grave concern for the violation of the bodily autonomy and reproductive rights of detained people. Everyone, regardless of their immigration status, their language, or their incarceration, deserves to control their own reproductive choices and make informed choices about their bodies. While we applaud the resolution, we are greatly concerned that it illustrates the United States as a government that continues a policy of forced sterilization, said Lucy Simpson, Executive Director of NIWRC. As an organization dedicated to ending violence against Indigenous women, we know all too well the end result of such a federal policy. Now, if you want, you can hit pause and try to read this if you can. It's a little blurry, but I'm sure there's some information you can take out of it if you possibly maybe make it full screen. The United States' long history of past government policies of sterilization. The federal law and policies of forced sterilization were not limited to Native American women, but targeted other women of color, disabled, and poor women. This period of forced sterilization is known as the eugenics movement. The driving ideology behind the eugenics movement is that of survival of the fittest. America would be stronger if only the physically and financially strong reproduced. The House resolution indicates forced sterilization remains an issue to be addressed, Simpson said. As the NIWRC, and further as a movement, we must oppose forced sterilization of women and uphold their reproductive rights. In 1907, Governor J. Frank Hanley of Indiana approved a eugenics law, making Indiana the first state to approve a compulsory eugenic sterilization law. This law made sterilization mandatory for certain individuals in state custody and prohibited marriage licenses for imbeciles, epileptic, and those of unsound minds. This law was passed for the purpose of decreasing reproduction among these individuals, based on the belief by Indiana authorities that criminality, mental problems, and pauperism were hereditary. In 1921, the Indiana Supreme Court ruled the 1907 sterilization law unconstitutional in Williams et al. Versus Smith because it denied due process of the law guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. In 1927, a revised law was implemented reinstating sterilization, adding court appeals. It was not repealed until 1974. 15 other states enacted similar laws in the following decades. The Indiana Historical Bureau states, it is difficult to state the exact number of people sterilized by Indiana law because different institutions around the state used varying methods of record keeping. 2 academic studies place the total number of people sterilized around 2,500. In 1927, the U.S. Supreme Court, in Buck v. Bell, upheld a state's right to forcibly sterilize a person considered feeble-minded. Buck v. Bell defended the involuntary sterilization of 17-year-old Carrie Buck, who was an inmate of the Virginia State Colony for epileptic and feeble-minded, after Carrie gave birth to an illegitimate daughter. Chief Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes justified the decision by saying, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Maybe he should have started with himself. Because of this decision, as many as 70,000 Americans were forcibly sterilized during the 20th century. 26 more states passed laws allowing involuntary sterilizations in the decade following Buck versus Bell. Between 1907 and 1939, more than 30,000 people in 29 states were sterilized, unknowingly or against their will, while incarcerated in prisons or psychiatric institutions. Nearly half of these procedures occurred in California. Following the horrors of the Holocaust, the ideology of the eugenics movement lost popularity. Geneticists realized that the inheritance of traits is much more complex than the simplistic version eugenicists had purported. However, throughout the 1950s, eugenics did not disappear but instead changed form. Rather than using arguments of heredity and defective genes, the argument shifted to concerns about family size and dependency on the government. For example, poor and minority women were framed as hyperbreeders who could not sustain themselves and were draining public resources. Following this reframing of eugenics, sterilization increased in the 50s and 60s in many southern states such as North Carolina and Virginia. This increase came at precisely the same time that Congress created Medicare and Medicaid, and the African Americans gained access to such federal programs after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This was no coincidence. Bitter about the demise of segregated Jim Crow America and the expansion of protections for the poor, authorities embraced sterilization to prevent poor and minority communities from advancing socially. In 1969, the Federal Court of Appeals, 3rd District, California, in Jessen v. County Shasta, ruled that voluntary sterilization is legal when informed consent has been given, that sterilization is an acceptable method of family planning, and that sterilization may be a fundamental right requiring constitutional protection. A woman sued her county hospital for performing a sterilization operation on her after she signed a consent form. This case served to encourage doctors to perform more sterilization operations during the 1970s. Previously, many physicians had assumed that sterilization as a birth control method was illegal. In 1970, Congress passed the Family Planning Services and Population Research Act. This act allocated $383 million for contraceptive programs, including grants to hospitals that performed voluntary sterilizations, in an attempt to reduce the number of welfare recipients. Many hospitals, however, used these funds to operate on minority women who were unaware of the procedures they were undergoing. As a result of this legislation, during the 1970s, the U.S. Health, Education, and Welfare, HUE, funded 90% of the annual sterilization costs for poor people. Sterilization for women increased 350% between 1970 and 1975, and about 1 million American women were sterilized each year. Sterilizations of Native and Puerto Rican women increased following the Family Planning Services and Population Research Act of 1970. According to a 1973 Health Research Group study and interviews conducted by Dr. Bernard Rosenfeld in 1974 and 75, the majority of physicians were white, Euro-American males who believed that they were helping society by limiting the number of births in low-income minority families. They assumed that they were enabling the government to cut funding for Medicaid and welfare programs while lessening their own personal tax burden to support the programs. Physicians also increased their own personal income by performing hysterectomies and tubal ligations instead of prescribing alternate methods of birth control. Sorry for the Freudian slip. Some of them did not believe that American Indian and other minority women had the intelligence to use other methods of birth control effectively, and that there were already too many minority individuals causing problems in the nation, including the Black Panthers and American Indian movement. Supreme Court cases 74 and 75. Ralph versus Weinberger. In 1974, the Southern Poverty Law Center filed a case on behalf of two black sisters in Montgomery, Alabama, Minnie, 12 years old, and Mary Alice, 14 years old, who were coerced into federally funded sterilization. Their illiterate and poorly educated mother signed an X on a piece of paper under the assumption that her daughters would be given birth control shots. Instead, they were surgically sterilized. The case exposed the reality of federally funded widespread sterilization. The lawsuit led to the requirement that doctors obtain informed consent before performing sterilization procedures. Informed consent means that the doctor must fully impart the nature and purpose of the procedure to the patient, along with the possibility of success, the risks involved, and alternative treatments. Judge Gerhard Gessel stated that the regulations must be amended to require individuals seeking sterilization to be orally informed at the very outset that no federal benefits can be withdrawn because of a failure to accept sterilization. In response, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, HUE, published revised regulations on April 18, 1974. These regulations defined informed consent and dictated that every sterilization consent form prominently state that benefits will not be held or withdrawn if the patient decides not to be sterilized. Madrigal versus Quilligan. In a 1975 class action lawsuit, 10 plaintiffs accused medical residents at the Los Angeles County USC Medical Center of performing tubal ligations on Mexican-American women with no or dubious consent. These 10 women alleged that medical personnel at the hospital systematically coerced Mexican-American women into submitting to sterilization. The plaintiffs lost the case, but the publicity of the case helped overturn California's 70-year-old sterilization laws in 1975. As a result, California strengthened regulations for ensuring voluntary consent to sterilization. California's prisons authorized the sterilization of nearly 150 female inmates between 2006 and 2010 without the state's approval, in a practice that wasn't outlawed until 2014. According to the Center for Investigative Reporting, doctors under contract with the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation performed tubal ligation surgeries on at least 148 female inmates at 2 facilities. Another 100 cases possibly took place between 1997 and 2010. A 2014 report by the California State Auditor stated that nearly 1/3 of these tubal ligations were done illegally without informed consent. In September 2014, California Governor Jerry Brown signed a bill prohibiting forced sterilizations in prisons. Current hysterectomies in detention facilities. On September 14, 2020, Nurse Dawn Wooten filed a whistleblower complaint with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security's Office of Inspector General. Wooten reported that a gynecologist performed hysterectomies on detained migrants at the Irwin County Detention Center without their full consent. Wooten worked at the Irwin County Detention Center in Ocilla, Georgia. This complaint was filed by a coalition of organizations, including Project South, Georgia Detention Watch, Georgia Latino Alliance for Human Rights, and South Georgia Immigrant Support Network. Wooten said that nearly every woman who went to see a doctor was told that she had to undergo a hysterectomy. Wooten called the doctor a uterus collector. Most women in the detention center spoke predominantly Spanish, and many expressed to Wooten that they did not fully understand what the procedure entailed, which is not surprising considering the fact that this guy sounds like probably fucking Ed Gein or Ted Bundy or something. Independent doctors that provide treatment for ICE detainees are paid for the procedures they perform with the Department of Homeland Security funds. Procedures like those performed by Dr. Amin are normally billed at thousands of dollars each. Since the filing of this complaint, ICE and the hospital in Irwin County have released data showing that 2 full hysterectomies have been performed on women detained at Irwin in the past 3 years. Additional first-hand accounts are now emerging from detainees who have undergone other invasive gynecological procedures that they did not fully understand or may not have been medically necessary. The New York Times reported that Dr. Mahendra Amin, the detention center's primary gynecologist, seemed to consistently recommend surgical intervention even when it did not seem medically necessary at the time and non-surgical treatment options were available. It went on to report, both the reviewing doctors and all of the women interviewed by the Times raised concerns about whether Dr. Amin had adequately explained the procedures he performed or provided his patients with less invasive alternatives. Spanish-speaking women said a nurse who spoke Spanish was only sporadically present during their exams. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi issued a statement in response to the whistleblower complaint. Pelosi described the conditions of the Irwin County Detention Center as a staggering abuse of human rights. She called for the DHS Inspector General to immediately investigate the allegations detailed in the complaint. Following the complaint, the House Judiciary Committee and the Hispanic Caucus investigated Irwin County Detention Center. Several congressional Democrats visited the center on September 26th. Texas Representative Sylvia R. Garcia said that they heard statements directly from women who were subjected to unnecessary and unwanted medical procedures without their consent. On the House floor, Representative Garcia reads excerpts from a letter signed by 24 detainees. read excerpts. The experts, translated from Spanish to English by Garcia, stated, "They do not understand what's happening to their body or what they did to their body. They told them they were going to perform a study and they deceived them because a surgery room should not be a school. Why are we being punished? You send us to a crazy person that mutilates bodies and they deport us so that we won't say anything." On October 2nd, 2020, the House of Representatives passed a resolution condemning the hysterectomies reported at the center, recognizing that everyone, whether in custody or not, deserves to make their own decisions regarding their bodies. More transparency and accountability is needed to protect those in the custody of ICE. The need for the Department of Homeland Security to pause the removal of any person who underwent a medical procedure at the Irwin County Detention Center and grant them immediately access to medical treatment and a second opinion from a professional outside the center, and asking the Irwin County Detention Center to immediately comply with investigation requests. Ensure those impacted by these procedures be able to share their stories without fear or retaliation, and to hold those involved accountable. In response to the hysterectomies in ICE detention centers and support of the House resolution, Juana Mahel Dixon, NCAI Task Force Co-Chair on Violence Against Women, stated, "I am deeply concerned about the allegations of the whistleblower of hysterectomies on women held at the Georgia ICE Detention Center. As one of the thousands of American Indian women sterilized without my informed consent, I know the consequence of such federal policies for women and Indian nations. Forced sterilization was the means used to terminate indigenous peoples. It failed. Our nation survived, but we will never forget. As indigenous peoples, we must stand in support of the House resolution calling for an investigation of the medical procedures on women being detained without their informed consent." And here's some links at the bottom, which I will include in the video description. As always, thanks for listening. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. And also, fight the power.